Welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to be looking at the Red Badge of Courage. Now, I know you're a literature student, so we're not going to just give you the Wikipedia summary.
Right.
We're going to really try and understand why this book is still relevant, over a century later.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, The Red Badge of Courage, if you're not familiar with it, is a war novel set during the Civil War.
Right.
But it's not your typical, just dates and battles kind of story.
Right. Not at all. It's really all about this guy, Henry Fleming. He's in the Union Army. He's young. He's a private. And he's just obsessed with being brave.
Yeah, he wants to prove it.
He wants to prove it so badly.
Desperate for it, almost.
Desperate for it.
Yeah.
And he thinks that the only way to do that is to get a wound in battle. That's his goal.
A red badge of courage.
Red badge of courage.
Yeah.
Right? He needs that physical proof to prove to himself and everyone else that he's a hero.
Yeah, and it's interesting because he's really struggling internally. He's not like this, typical hero. He's got all these doubts and fears.
Right. And then, of course, he gets thrown into war.
Yeah.
And it's not at all what he expected.
Yeah.
It's just chaos and terror and just a whole lot of fear.
Yeah, and that's where his internal conflict really comes out.
Yeah.
He's not acting like a hero. He's grappling with cowardice.
Right.
He's ashamed. And he just can't make his actions match up with the image he has of himself.
And then there's this one scene where he does get his red badge of courage.
Right.
But not how he imagined.
Not at all. I mean, not at all.
He gets hit in the head by another soldier.
Panicking.
During a retreat.
A retreat.
It's just so ironic, right?
Totally.
This wound that was supposed to be a symbol of courage.
Yeah.
It just becomes this mark of shame.
And it really forces him to think about, what it means to be courageous.
Yeah. What does real courage actually look like?
Yeah. Is it charging into danger or is it facing your own weaknesses?
Right. It makes you think.
That's exactly what Crane wants us to think about. He's challenging this traditional idea of heroism and making us look at how complicated people act when they're under pressure.
Yeah.
Especially in war.
Especially in war. And then there's the way he uses nature in the book.
Oh, yeah.
It's not just a background. It's this whole other character.
Almost like a force?
A force.
Yeah.
And he describes it so vividly.
Landscape, the sun, the sky.
It all changes with Henry's moves.
Reflecting his inner turmoil.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like this powerful being.
Yeah.
That doesn't care at all about what the humans are going through.
Indifferent. Yeah.
There's one part where Henry compares himself to a squirrel running away from danger.
Oh, yeah.
It's like he's looking for an excuse for his own fear in nature.
Exactly. And that's Crane's symbolism at work. He uses these little things from nature to show us deep truths about being human.
Especially in war.
Yeah.
So we have Henry wanting that badge.
Yeah.
Fighting his own demons.
Battling himself.
Yeah. And surrounded by nature.
Yeah.
That's beautiful, but also doesn't care about him.
It's complex.
It is.
Yeah.
And what's so cool about Crane is that he doesn't give us any easy answers.
No.
He just shows us these complicated situations and lets the reader figure it out.
And that's great for a literature student.
Oh, yeah.
So much to analyze and interpret.
A goldmine. And here's another thing that's really interesting.
What's that?
Crane wrote this whole book about war.
Yeah.
Without ever being in a war himself.
That's right. He relied on historical accounts.
Right? Interviews with veterans. And even his own experience playing football.
To make it feel real.
Which makes you think.
It really does.
How can someone write so convincingly about something they've never actually experienced?
It makes you wonder about the power of imagination. Empathy.
And research. Yeah, how much you can really understand something without living through it yourself.
Right. And speaking of understanding.
Yeah.
Let's look at how people reacted to the Red Badge of Courage when it first came out.
Okay.
It wasn't all positive, was it? It wasn't. Some people loved it. They thought it was really original and realistic. But others, especially some veterans, they really didn't like it. They thought it was like a fake portrayal of war and soldiers.
Some even called it a vicious satire. What was it about this book that got people so riled up?
Well, I think part of it was that Crane didn't hold back on showing how brutal and chaotic war really is.
Right.
He didn't try to make it glamorous or heroic.
Right, all those romanticized ideas about war that were popular back then.
Yeah, he totally went against them.
And this was only 30 years after the Civil War.
Yeah, people were still dealing with the trauma.
Yeah, those wounds were still fresh.
Exactly. And for Crane to come along and show soldiers being scared and panicking, even being cowardly,
Right.
that challenged everything people believed about courage and sacrifice.
He was kind of like shaking things up.
Yeah, he was saying, hey, this is what being a soldier is really like.
Yeah.
It's not always pretty or heroic.
And that's why he focused so much on Henry's internal struggle.
Exactly. We see Henry questioning everything he thought he knew about himself, about war, about what it means to be brave.
And that was probably really new for readers back then.
Oh, yeah. They were used to war stories being much more straightforward.
Yeah. Like good guys versus bad guys.
Right, but Crane was showing the psychological side of war.
The human cost.
Yeah, the toll it takes on people.
And how sometimes you can't even tell the difference between being brave and being a coward.
Exactly, and that makes the Red Badge of Courage so powerful even today.
It still feels relevant,
Because it's about real human experiences.
not just some idealized version of war.
Right, it makes you think about uncomfortable things.
And speaking of uncomfortable things,
Yeah.
let's talk about the imagery in the book.
Oh, yeah.
It's pretty intense.
It's not for the faint of heart.
Not at all.
Mm.
But it's also really effective.
It is. He uses such vivid and visceral descriptions.
Yeah. And he doesn't shy away from the gruesome stuff.
Nope. He wants you to see and feel the horrors of war.
Like all that red imagery,
The blood,
the sunsets,
the fire.
even Henry's own anger.
It's all connected.
It's like he's blurring the lines between beauty and violence.
Between nature and war.
Yeah. It's really unsettling.
And then there's that whole idea of nature's indifference that we talked about earlier.
Right, like nature doesn't care about the humans and their little wars.
It's a key part of Crane's naturalism.
Can you explain what that means? Like, what is naturalism in literature?
It's basically the idea that humans are controlled by forces outside of themselves.
Like nature.
Yeah, nature, but also things like our instincts and our environment.
So we don't really have free will.
Not as much as we like to think.
That's kind of a depressing thought.
It can be, but it's also kind of realistic.
I guess so.
And in The Red Badge of Courage, Crane really emphasizes this by showing nature as this huge, powerful force.
That doesn't care at all about what happens to the humans.
Right. It's like the war is just another natural disaster.
Like a hurricane or an earthquake.
Exactly. And that makes the whole story even more tragic.
Because it suggests that all this human suffering is meaningless in the grand scheme of things.
It's a pretty bleak outlook.
It is. But maybe it's also a way of making us confront the truth.
About our place in the world.
Yeah. And maybe that can help us find meaning and purpose, even in the midst of all the chaos.
That's one way to look at it. And that's what makes the Red Badge of Courage so
It
fascinating.
makes you think about big questions.
Yeah. About war, about human nature, about the meaning of life.
And there's this one interesting thing about the book that a lot of people don't realize.
Oh, really? What's that?
It never actually says what battle Henry's fighting in.
Oh, yeah. You're right.
Yeah.
It just talks about the battle.
Yeah. Like, Crane never gives us any specific details about the time or place.
Which is weird, right? For a war novel.
You'd think he'd want to ground the story in some real historical event.
But I think he did that on purpose.
Really?
Because he wanted the story to be about more than just one specific battle.
So it's like a universal story about the experience of war.
Exactly. It doesn't matter if it's the Civil War or World War II or some future conflict.
Right. The feelings of fear and courage and doubt are the same.
And by leaving out those historical details, Crane makes the story timeless.
It could be happening anywhere at any time.
Right. And it also lets the reader focus more on Henry's inner world.
Yeah, we don't get bogged down in trying to figure out what year it is or what the military strategy was.
It's all about Henry's thoughts and feelings.
His stream of consciousness.
Yeah, it's like we're right there in his head with him.
Experiencing the chaos and brutality of war firsthand.
And that's what makes the book so powerful.
It shows us that war is more than just battles and dates.
It's about what happens to people on the inside.
The psychological effects,
The trauma.
the way it changes who you are,
And that's something that everyone can relate to.
whether you've been in a war or not.
Right? We've all faced challenges that have tested our courage and our limits.
So for our listener out there who's studying literature,
Yeah.
what do you think they should take away from this? This idea that Crane didn't name the battle,
I'd say pay attention to what's not being said.
like the silences in the music.
Exactly. Sometimes what's left out is just as important as what's included.
It's like a challenge to the reader.
Yeah. To think critically and fill in the gaps.
And in this case, I think it makes the story even more universal.
Because it's not about one specific battle or one specific war.
It's about the human experience of conflict.
Yeah. The things that we all go through when we're pushed to our limits.
Well, I think this has been a really fascinating deep dive.
Yeah, we've covered a lot.
We talked about Henry's struggles and Crane's writing style.
And how the book was received when it first came out.
And how it's still relevant today.
Yeah.
But before we go, I want to leave our listener with something to think about.
Okay.
Throughout the book, Henry's surrounded by all these other soldiers. And they all talk about courage and glory.
Yeah, like they're all heroes.
But do they actually live up to those ideals?
That's a good question.
Because their actions don't always match their words.
Right.
And I think that contrast really highlights Henry's own struggle.
Yeah, he's trying to figure out what real courage is.
Not just what other people say it is.
And that's a journey we all have to take in our own way.
And define our own values and live up to them.
Even when it's hard.
Even when it's scary.
Especially then.
And that's what makes The Red Badge of Courage such a powerful book.
It reminds us that being brave isn't always about charging into battle.
Sometimes it's about facing our own fears and doubts.
And finding the strength to keep going.
Even when we're not sure what the right path is.
Yeah, that's real courage.
And that's something worth thinking about. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into The Red Badge of Courage.